It is a beautiful morning here in Lagos, Nigeria. A beautiful Thursday morning at that. I'm Kayode Okikelu. Don't worry, the rest of the team will be here, but we have another part of the team in Abuja.
Well, good morning from the Federal Capital Territory. I'm Maofe Ogunyusu.
Just before we go into the issues for the day, let's give you a recap of the briefing of the PTF COVID-19 yesterday.
By the chairman of the Presidential Task Force, SGF, sir.
It is the first briefing by members of the Presidential Task Force on COVID-19 after the Salah holiday. The chairman of the task force leads the briefing for the day. He gives progress reports on indigenous efforts to find a cure for COVID-19.
As a measure of the importance attached to research and development of local capacity for finding a cure for COVID-19, the Federal Ministry of Health held a virtual meeting with a number of researchers and scientists with claims to cure of COVID-19. And out of the numerous claimants, 3 were found to deserve further investigation and have been forwarded to the relevant authorities for appropriate review.
However, the increasing number of confirmed cases of COVID-19 is a major source of worry for the Presidential Task Force.
We are concerned about the increasing number of confirmed cases. This is because very high cases could seriously exceed the capacity of our health system to cope.
Fielding questions at the news conference, members of the PTF speak about the strain of the virus in Nigeria, update on the evacuees who have completed their quarantine period, as well as the Benue Index case that was discharged from the hospital last week.
I can confirm to you that from the Nigeria Institute of Medical Research, they have been able to establish that the strain we have here is the same as the strain in Wuhan.
To the best of my knowledge, only the 3 cases that were reported in respect of the UAE in Lagos were the only positive tests that we had. So all the others were negative. The batch from the United States and the batch from the, I think it was the United Kingdom, we've also been able to return their test results, and they've all been able to now leave quarantine. And those that needed to go to Lagos, arrangements were made, and they were able to fly to Lagos.
If it was now, the patient would not have stayed 45 days. That's the impact of the science coming out now, that the virus is not viable after 10 to 14 days.
There are currently over 8,000 confirmed cases of COVID-19 in Nigeria. Over 2,380 have been discharged, just as 249 deaths have been recorded.
So many questions to ask, and so many people needing reassurance about how well we are doing as far as COVID-19 is concerned in Nigeria. Well, the WHO has given Africa as a continent, some kudos that look, the coronavirus isn't doing as badly in Africa as feared, and as it is ravaging so many other nations and continents of the world. Is that a good thing or not? So many other issues to look at this morning as we engage Dr. Osaritin Yoha. He's a consultant clinical biologist, microbiologist from the UBTH. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. First of all, are you comforted with the WHO's affirmation of the fact that Africa seems to be managing this fairly well? Africa has the lowest number of cases and lowest number of mortalities. Is that something comforting to you, or is it something that we should suspect?
Yeah, going by the figures that we have, I think we are not doing badly. It goes to confirm that we planned ahead and we're able to manage the situation so far.
So, but then there's also that clinical test of clinical trial of those medications that the WHO stopped, but NAFDAC, Nigeria's own NAFDAC, is insisting we need to go ahead with it. Do you see that as a conflict, or do you think it is something that is also medically okay?
Yeah, we have we have a textbook that we use in internal medicine that dates back to 2010. It actually describes the mechanism of action of chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine against coronavirus. But you know, this is a newer version, a newer strain of that coronavirus, and a lot of studies being undertaken on it. So we do know for a fact that chloroquine actually prevents the first step in the mechanism of pathogenesis of coronavirus, and that it prevents the entering of the virus into the cell. So I think it is too early to stop those trials. And for a fact that we have been using chloroquine for decades, and we have been able to overcome most of the side effects. So I think it's too early to stop. So we should proceed further to do further, because what they have gotten is just from one section of the world. So I think it's too early to stop it.
That also be responsible for the difference in position or opinion of Nigeria's NAFDAC and the WHO. The fact that some medications, for instance, chloroquine, is something that's age-long in Africa in the treatment of malaria. And of course, Africa is known, to have handled so many more cases of malaria than any other continent in the world. Could that be a reason, part of the reason for the low number of cases that Africa is dealing with as far as COVID-19 is concerned?
Yeah, there are a number of factors that need to be put together and confirmed. We talked about the high temperature. We talked about the endemicity of malaria, and then tuberculosis, and most of the drugs that we have been using. So there are quite a lot of factors that are contributing. Don't forget also the age, because our average age here is 40 to 45, and compared to what we have in all other centers where we are having high mortality, where they seem to have the aged, and those are the kind of people that the disease itself have higher impact on. So there are quite a lot of factors to consider here.
Yes, those factors, a lot of people have talked about them, but when it comes to science, having scientific basis, we could talk about a lot of factors. Which of these factors are actually founded in firm, data, in firm science, beyond the conjectures that we have heard? Which of them are actually for real, if I could use that term?
I think for now is the age, because the deaths that we have recorded so far, they are usually the aged and those with underlying illnesses. I think that is the major factor that is playing its role here so far.
Okay, now let's talk about Nigeria's way of handling this, the projections we are seeing. And we talked about the WHO's statement saying that, well, Africa is not doing too badly. But when you also hear the Commissioner for Health in Lagos saying we have not peaked yet, the Minister of Health also saying we have not gotten to our peak, and then we hear statements like, well, we are doing good. Is there a concern here that maybe this is just the early phases and things might even spike moving forward? Is there that concern, and how do we rally round to sort that?
Yeah, but our mortality is low compared to some other centers. So that's a good sign. But the number of tests that we are doing is not enough And then I think the authorities are doing all that they can to increase the testing rate.
Okay. Now, talking about the lockdown, the easing of the lockdown, we're getting to the end of this extended 2 weeks of the easing of the lockdown. And I recall when this was about to be extended beyond the first 2 weeks, there were issues of compliance, there were talks about communication, how people have bought into this fight against COVID-19, and of course, compliance follows after that, the number of tests we are planning to do and all that. So as we near the end of this extended phase, what do you see happening based on our performance in the past few days?
Yeah, like I said, we need to increase our tests because we are not maximizing the lockdown, to actually do a lot of tests. And a lot of factors are responsible for that. The capacity of the testing center and the availability of reagents. But to open the lockdown right now, I don't think it's advisable.
Okay, well, are you saying that we should extend this easing phase even further by another 2 weeks? Mind you, that will be an extra 2 weeks, by the way. Is that what you're saying? Or you're saying we should move to the next phase but still put the measures in place? What do you propose, basically?
Yes. First phase of the easing, you see the compliance really poor. So we really need time to imbibe the culture of, social distancing, hand washing, and interstate travel. So there are a lot of things that mitigate against the expected result of the lockdown. And so if you ease it further, I'm sure a lot of people that have doubt that the coronavirus pandemic exists, further just tell them that there's really nothing there, that is all politics. So we still need time to understand
For Doctor, do we need it? Well, you've talked about us ramping up the testing. You've also talked about the low compliance with the lockdown guidelines that were given. What's the assurance we have that if we extend the lockdown, this phase of the lockdown, people will comply? So you have emphasized the need for us to increase testing. But one of the things that the PTF COVID-19 has also said is that they are already concerned about the increasing number of tests, increasing number of positive cases of COVID-19 in the country, because if it increases a little too much, it could overwhelm the system. So if we were to extend this lockdown, what should we be doing? What have we missed doing that you think that an extension would address and will not make worse the already bad issue of poor compliance with the regulations?
Yeah, it's to address those who are concerned with enforcing those guidelines, so that people can be forced to comply, and then increasing the testing. We still need to extend the test centers across the country, and then the publicity to mobilize Nigerians to come out for testing.
Let's talk about the performance of the various states, 34 of them, as well as the FCT, making 35 territories in all in Nigeria. How would you assess the way the states themselves, of course you can see these figures now, the various states and then the number of tests that they have conducted. How would you assess the handling of this pandemic by the various states and territories in Nigeria?
Yes, they are doing the best they can. Don't forget that we didn't have all these facilities right from the beginning. So it's a gradual process. And we need time to expand and to be able to cover a larger ground. Some of those tests, some of those centers that have a high figure, we need to increase more testing there. And for states that claim that they do not have, positive cases, there are other ways you can go around it. Perhaps you can do antibody tests for selected few to see whether it's actually, present in those areas.
It's that claim to not have any confirmed case of COVID-19. Of course, I know you're referring to Kogi and Cross River. And if you look at that breakdown from the NCDC of tests conducted, you see that Kogi was done just one test, Cross River 8. So basically, it ties back to what you were saying. But the big question usually is, when you say we need to do more in terms of testing, how do we achieve that? Because it seems as though we're not going the way of rapid test kits. It also seems we're not going the way of pooling. So how do we ramp up our test capacity?
Yeah, right now I think it's to pump in more resources so that they can get more reagents. Once they have more reagents, I think the capacity they have now will be able to do more. And then to go around to sensitize people and then screen people for testing. The issue with the rapid test is, we need to define the purpose of the testing. We are testing right now so that we're able to identify those of us who are shedding the virus. And that also explains why the process of collecting samples is directed at, taking the sample from the particular spots where the shedding, comes out, the nasopharynx and the oropharynx, compared to the rapid test where you take blood sample. We are not concerned about blood transmission right now. It is shedding. And so when you collect the sample then and you're able to identify those who are shedding, then you isolate them from the community. That is the purpose. So that's why we cannot be using, even if it is 100% sensitive and specific, we cannot afford to be using rapid test right now for that.
Well, just to clear the air, Kogi has recorded 2 cases according to, figures released by the NCDC, the latest figures. So maybe, just maybe, this is as a result of the more tests that have been, conducted in this state. But, looking at you saying that reagents would maybe improve our testing capacity. We've heard time and again that we have a capacity of more than 2,000. But if you see the average number of tests we do per day, for example, the latest figures released show that we did 1,741 tests. The day before, we did 1,120 tests. So even with the capacity we have on ground right now, we are not doing as well. We're not using that capacity full-fledged. So what's the assurance, really? And I'd like you to maybe suggest, what are the things we need to do to ensure that we make use of that capacity optimally?
Yeah, it's to send people out for contact tracing and to screen. You can screen people by way of, cluster and, taking their temperature and taking their history. And those that meet the guideline, you collect more samples. If you wait in the lab, the samples are not going to come on their own. It's human beings that need to go out and, start for it. So it's to send people out and then also do public enlightenment.
The issue of, perhaps some glimmer of hope from the NCDC in collaboration with a number of other agencies in Nigeria about the rapid test kit, the RNA Swift. From where you sit as a microbiologist and, as a professional in this field, how effective do you see deploying that being in our quest to contain this virus?
Sorry, I didn't get that.
The NCDC, in collaboration with a number of other agencies in Nigeria, came up with this RNA Swift, a rapid test kit, and just in the quest to contain this virus. How effective do you see that being in all of the things that you have been talking about?
You mean the gene expert?
No, the RNA test kit that's just been come up with by Nigeria's government.
Oh, well, I don't understand. I read somewhere that a Nigerian discovered the RNA, which were going to be used for manufacture of extraction kits. Is that the one you are talking about?
Yes.
Yes. Well, that's just recent. So if we are able to, once it's validated, like it's done now, and we are able to, get the commercial manufacturing of it, it will also
see a likelihood of that evolving into something where it can be available commercially, so people can buy these things themselves, test themselves, and confirm whether or not they have the disease?
No. It means it will provide, it will make more available reagents. It's just one aspect of the reagents that we need for the present test that we are doing. So it will help to resolve the issue of lack of reagents, not just for Nigeria, but
Okay. Let me just quickly, touch on this. We're counting down to election in Edo State, and of course, INEC has released some form of guideline as to how elections will be conducted in the COVID-19 pandemic reality. But as a microbiologist, do you have any fears really ahead of these elections?
Well, the INEC has said that their hands are really tied by the Constitution. Otherwise, just like they postpone exams and all other things, and put on hold, it would have been better to shift the date. But since they don't have any option than to go ahead with the election, we need to follow the guidelines. So it's just part of the easing down of the lockdown. Social distancing, hand hygiene, and where possible, use of electronic means for campaign and all this stuff.
So you're confident that, going forward with these guidelines that INEC has put forward, there shouldn't be any cause for concern?
Yeah, people have to be careful. It's when you are alive that you can celebrate the victory of election. So those who are contesting are those who are their supporters, and those of us that will go ahead to vote, we ensure that we have to do it the way we go out for shopping in the market or going to the bank. So it means the timeline too will have to be extended so that people can have enough time to give adequate distancing and spacing.
You also said earlier that people weren't complying with the guidelines. What's the assurance that they will comply with these guidelines for the elections?
Yeah, it means those who will enforce compliance, we need to be enhanced or increase where possible.
Well, we have to thank you very much for your time this morning. Dr. Saratin, you are consultant clinical microbiologist at UBTH. Thank you so much for your time and perspectives.
Thank you.
All right, we're back in a moment. Please stay with us. All right, so it's time for us to take a look at another issue. But then there was this one that we just omitted earlier, and that's the fact that Kogi State is one of those states now that has been added on that infamous list, we say.
Yeah. So Leaves just crossed rivers. Yesterday, the NCDC released figures. Apparently, Kogi had recorded 2. A lot of people have gotten used to seeing the figures without Kogi and thought, maybe, just maybe. But this morning, a lot of people caught up to it, the fact that Kogi has now reported 2 new cases, according to the NCDC. So the figures of the tests that were conducted state by state, where you see Kogi just doing 1 test, was before this, apparently. So we look forward to seeing how many tests Kogi has conducted as at yesterday, to understand how this came about. So this one you're seeing was a day before that, where Kogi conducted 1 test. So obviously the tests should have increased from 1 to at least 3 for them to have recorded 2 new cases.
Well, pretty much sure that within the next few hours, days, we will have more updates as far as that is concerned. Suffice to say that from the World Health Organization and in the eyes of many people in the world, we're not doing badly in Africa, Nigeria especially. But then one other thing that has come out of this is, okay, so how are we going to conduct elections in the middle of all of this? You know, this is not 100 years ago. This is 2020, and this is happening to us right now. I don't know if the Constitution foresaw a situation where we'd have to conduct elections during a pandemic. Something funny came to my mind yesterday looking at this thing. I was like, okay, so when the posters are going to come out, are they going to have the contestants with masks or without masks?
To show your compliance, the level of compliance.
I don't know. That just came to my mind. But anyway, let's head on with this conversation now and see how much of these emergencies or incidences are contained, have been captured one way or another in our laws. Let's speak with the Executive Director of PLAC, Clement Nwankwo. He joins us online. Thank you so much. Oh, well, I understand that we're still trying to get, because, you know, it will really be interesting to find out how we fare in that regard. How, if at all, our laws has found a way to capture any unforeseen contingencies.
And naturally, you look at the latest guidelines, if I may, released by INEC. I mean, they call it the INEC policy on conducting elections in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's quite elaborate. I mean, it touches on some issues. I mean, the way people should be spaced at the polling units, you know, what they should do, the fact that, which actually jumped at me, the fact that they'll need to purchase extra things, like, of course, face masks for their workers. They have to purchase extra sanitizers and the usual, you know, PPEs. And on one hand, I'm wondering, how will that work? Definitely, because I know that that was not captured in their 2020 budget, I believe, except they preempted this. So that's also another issue. But basically, it's good to know that INEC...
That's probably talking about some extra budgetary expense?
I mean...
Will that come from the national, the federal government coffers, or the PTF COVID-19? I don't know.
Those are big questions that we're waiting to find out. And you know that Edo and Ondo is coming up in a few months. Yet the build-up has been quite interesting with the usual back and forth. But looking at the election proper, this is going to be a big test for us. People are saying this might present us an opportunity, you know, to have the best of elections, especially because people are expected to really maintain physical distancing. We shouldn't have crowds at the areas where the results are being collated. They talk about electronic form of, you know, maybe not elections, because INEC says maybe from 2021 we'll look at it, but ways that we can look into electronic methods of making the election better. So the guidelines are quite extensive, but does it cover all the areas? One of them is the fact that people are saying that why is it voluntary for workers to be tested before, you know, election? Some are saying it should be compulsory for INEC workers to be tested for COVID-19 before the election. So yes, INEC has released these guidelines, but definitely you understand that we should try to break these things down to see how feasible they will be on that day.
Well, perhaps that would be a question of what the organization's policy, now that the guidelines released by INEC is for the conduct of the elections. But how about the INEC itself as an organization? What's the policy they have to manage the way their own, you know, staff would work? Because, you know, this morning I was, and, you know, security agencies are going to be involved as well. Definitely. This morning I had this, I was coming on my way, policemen stopped me and asked, you know, for a ride. And I was shocked because I expected that, look, these guys ought to be so well taken care of that while on the roads, whenever they want to go anywhere, their vehicles would be on standby. Well, that's probably a question for the organization that's the NPF as an organization to answer. But going back to INEC will have to determine as an organization what their own policy would be, how they would take in staff. Is that going to be part of the recruitment requirement that bring your certificate of compliance or whatever before you are taken in as an ad hoc staff or whatever? That is another matter that I think INEC may be looking at. But look at these pictures.
This will change. This should change come Edo and Ondo elections. This should not be what we'll definitely see.
That is the hope.
Yeah.
And that is the aspiration. But is that going to be our reality? Let's ask some of these questions from Clement Nwankwo, the Executive Director of PLAC. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. First of all, let me ask you, from what you see in the laws that set up INEC and compliance, conduct of elections, do you see anywhere in which our laws have captured the peculiarities of conducting an election during a pandemic such as this?
Not really. Certainly the guidelines that INEC has issued has not necessarily derived from any particular section of the existing electoral law or the Constitution. But the reality, of course, is that there is no prohibition of the guidelines that INEC has clarified and set out. Of course, INEC has in its meetings come up with these guidelines. The expectation, of course, is that these guidelines are being reviewed by different other stakeholders, civil society, political parties, the security agencies, particularly the police, who would be involved in helping to implement the guidelines. And the hope is that as we review these guidelines, as the elections approach, and this is a unique situation, we would be able to make further suggestions or recommendations to INEC on how best these guidelines can work out really effectively. For observers also, it's a question, what is the best way that you can observe elections to be able to truly and honestly state what you have observed? So I think it's still a lot of work to happen. Stakeholders have to look at what INEC has put out, be able to make suggestions to INEC on if there is a need, how to improve the guidelines that INEC has issued.
This perhaps is going to raise some other issues for legal practitioners such as yourself, because from what you say, if, as you say, the laws didn't capture the peculiarities, yet the INEC as an organization has to come up with guidelines that may or may not be factored into law. These exigencies, is it in any way against any law that such that we can say, any lawyer can come up and say, look, this happened during so time, so why should it not happen now? Will those would this kind of peculiarities be factored into law should such an argument occur at a time when there is no pandemic?
Well, like I said, I do not believe that any section or article in this guideline offends the existing laws. I think you can't always capture every circumstance in a law, and certainly with respect to Nigeria, where we often run back to constitutional alteration. Again, this is not one of those circumstances that you can say that you really need a law to enforce the guidelines. The key issue, I think, is really the question, how do you ensure that you do not, by an election, increase the risk of spread of transmittable diseases? And it's not just COVID, it could be really any transmittable disease. And I think that this provides an opportunity to help to deal with this situation. When you look at the system of vote in Nigeria, it requires that people are physically at polling units. It requires that election officials are physically on grounds to administer the different processes of elections. And I think that INEC outlining this is really to say this is some procedure for smoothing the implementation of elections. And we must note that there has been elections that has held in this pandemic period in some other parts of the world. And We're quite delighted that INEC has very creatively found a way to go on. Otherwise, it would be unconstitutional if it didn't go on. But to go on with the elections scheduled for Edo on September 19, and of course, subsequently Ondo in October, on October 10th of this year. So I think it's commendable that INEC is thinking proactively and coming up with the best ways to ensure that the pandemic, if it still is locked in November or in September or October, does not continue to spread because of its work.
And that ties to something a lot of public health practitioners say. In fact, we had a microbiologist just moments ago saying, if he had his way, then maybe this election should not be conducted. And looking at that policy document that INEC released saying that they will engage relevant authorities to designate election as an essential service to enable the commission function effectively in times of national emergency. So there's that conversation around whether or not this is really expedient. And I'd like you to weigh on it. In this time of a national emergency, global pandemic, some have even said we've not peaked yet. How expedient is electioneering?
Election is part of life, is part of a democracy, is part of how a government runs. And I think that the pandemic is there, but really at the end of the day, a country must be governed, a people must be governed. Government is for the people, and people have a right to make a choice and make a decision. And when you look, which is what puzzles me, we are all victims, and we must understand that. And people in government must understand that the people, including themselves, including all of us, are victims of the current crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic. So everything that is done by government, by institutions, must ensure that the effects, the consequences on people is minimized. And it is an essential responsibility on citizens to go out and vote. So I do not agree with anybody who suggests that votes should not happen because there is the crisis of COVID-19. Yes, the crisis is there, and we must commend INEC for thinking out the best way to ensure that the essential responsibility of citizenship is exercised in this period. And I think for all of us, it's a question, how do we ensure that this implementation of responsibility is carried out effectively? So INEC has mentioned the security services, the police, I must say, who have a responsibility to train, to prepare for a vote in a pandemic. And I think it's not just INEC. The police services have to come to some conclusion on how to train personnel to manage people during elections. And I don't mean beating up people, brutalizing people. We're all victims of COVID-19 pandemic situation. So the police services, the security services, observers, INEC must prepare to handle this situation in a special way to ensure that the essential service of votes to bring accountable public officials or elected officials who seek a revalidation or seek new votes, that this happens without denigrating on one of the essential tenets of democracy, which is renewal of choice, renewal of votes, or indeed voting anew elected officials.
Obviously, training and retraining will play a major role in that. And one thing that I noticed in that policy is the fact that for the first time, for example, INEC is working together with NCDC to conduct elections. But you also see the array of things that INEC has to purchase, like infrared thermometers, face masks for all their officials, by the way, sanitizers and other necessary equipment. There's also the training of INEC officials, training of other people, the security agencies and all that. And the big question is funds. How do you, because I want to believe that INEC did not see this coming, so they probably did not budget for this. How do you see us tackling that issue of funding, especially because we're counting down to September and October to conduct these polls? And preparation should have started at this point.
Well, I think it's a question of how INEC reallocates votes that it has at the present time. And if it finds that there is a need for additional funding, then approach the executive approach in the National Assembly to seek some environment of funds to INEC to be able to conduct this election. I proceed from the basis that elections in this country are far too expensive, and there must be some way of cutting down on cost of elections in this country. So I think that INEC must recognize, of course, that there is the challenge of funding at this time and work out the best modalities of environment of funds within existing accounting heads, but perhaps even managing resources in a very prudent manner. The National Assembly has a responsibility to take into account any request by INEC should there be need for additional funds. But we must also look at the responsibility of citizens, because in the policy document, INEC talked about its officials. Citizens themselves must also recognize that there are existing protocols for safety in the public place and must prepare themselves to be able to participate in this. The political parties must prepare themselves that their agents are provided with necessary PPE kits to be able to participate effectively in the elections and ensure that everybody is protected. So we expect that when people are going to the polling units to vote, that they wear face masks, they are able to provide for themselves hand wash sanitizers and so on. We expect that everybody who is going out to vote, and it's the responsibility of political parties who are campaigning and contesting in these elections, to enlighten people on what they need to do. For election observers as well, we will have the responsibility to enlighten people on preparations for actual vote on polling days. So there's a lot of responsibility on everyone. But the key thing, I think, is that the democratic right of citizens to vote in elections is preserved even in a pandemic.
To explore that issue, talking about our elections being too expensive. And I mean, obviously, you have said that INEC might look into cutting down costs in some areas. I wonder what INEC would say to that. But looking at that, what areas do you think INEC can actually cut down costs? I'm not sure if INEC officials can work from home like other people have tried to do, but what areas do you think this pandemic, provides for us to look into in cutting down costs?
Well, I think that, again, you have to have some means of collation of votes. And INEC has tried to experiment on collation electronically without necessarily having this as a formal process and part of the election process. And of course, we have to go back to the Electoral Act to ensure that amendments are made to enable some form of use of electronic system in voting. And I'm not talking about electronic voting machine, because those are going to be really, really very expensive to implement. I'm talking of existing mechanisms that INEC has at this time to collate votes. This should be able to trigger in and be possible that it is formalized and accepted as part of the election guidelines and processes. So I think that the National Assembly needs to go back to the question of the Electoral Act, and the National Assembly has been very slow in dealing with amendments that have already been made by it, but not that have lapsed. The work is virtually done. The National Assembly needs to just really go back and look at how to brush it up and ensure that it goes through passage and becomes part of our law. This would help INEC tremendously as it prepares for future elections, because some of the aspects of election being made to be electronic, the use of technology increased, would help significantly in reducing the cost of elections in this country. But certainly, elections in this country are far, far too expensive. And I think that there must be some convening to understand how best to ensure that elections are made cheaper in Nigeria.
Well, the costs of elections are borne by INEC as an institution and, of course, the political parties as well. But let me back up a little bit from before the election to electioneering, voting, beg your pardon, campaigning, primaries, and all of that. Political campaigns are usually done with crowds. And you'd also, of course, recall the hue and cry that trailed that rally that took place in Edo State by the People's Democratic Party. How do you see that playing out at this time, especially as we march towards the elections in Edo and Ondo states?
It's going to be a challenge, and I think it calls into play the role of the health institutions, NCDC and Ministry of Health and so on, to be able to, and INEC actually, to be able to develop protocols for campaigns in a pandemic. And I think it's something that behoves all of us, how to ensure that candidates for elections are known by voters. Voters make a choice based on the knowledge of those that they are voting for. The political parties have a responsibility to find how best to send out the message about who the candidates they are sponsoring for elections are. And I think that we also have to look at political parties. Part of the biggest challenge that the 2019 elections faced was to see 90-something political parties presenting presidential candidates, 70-something presenting presidential candidates for elections, when a lot of them had no preparations, had no capacity to campaign, had no capacity to even push forward the candidates, which takes us to the question, who should be on the ballot for any election? Should anybody who can find a name and have INEC register that name jump on the ballot? Again, it calls into question the amendments regarding the Electoral Act. It should be possible that people can register political parties, campaign on the issues as political parties, but not be on the ballot. There must be a qualification for a party to be on the ballot, and not just a name and a registration. They must meet certain criteria to be on the ballot. So overall, reducing the number of political parties running on any particular elections by ensuring that they qualify to be on the ballot, even if they are registered as political parties. But beyond that as well, we must outline criteria for campaigns, taking into account public health concerns, especially in a pandemic situation as we have today. But we really should not let the situation be a free-for-all, that people can campaign without the challenges that a pandemic creates.
Well, the guidelines will probably be come up with by the INEC and maybe COVID-19, PTF COVID-19 and all of that. But if you were to, I know it's very expensive to be a consultant, but if you were to offer free consulting for any political party wishing or hoping to hold a campaign, what would you counsel them to do?
Well, at this time, I mean, PLAC, Policy and Legal Advocacy Center, does a lot of work and makes up policy presentations on this that is available for use by INEC, by the National Assembly, by political parties. And I think that for a lot of the political parties, what we are suggesting is that there is an important need for limited campaigns, which means that rather than organize statewide campaigns, because you see political parties talk about the grand rally, the giant of all rallies, holding statewide rallies. I think that political parties should hold restricted rallies in small communities rather than in trying to involve large communities. Two, there's a need for increased use of electronic advertisements so that candidates themselves can use radio, can use social media, can use television to reach out to people as widely as possible. There are different means of communication that exist in this country, that exist as a result of the improvements in communication in the world. And I think that the political parties need to exploit and explore all of these communication tools to reach out to citizens. And as part of the protocol on campaign that should be developed, this all needs to be taken into account, but we should not under any circumstance allow political parties to get into a situation where it's a free-for-all, where you organize rallies without concern about the safety of those you have invited to listen to you at those rallies.
Well, there are two. One of the things that comes to me from what you just said now is, okay, maybe vote buying is going to take a big hit, but then we'll come back to that subsequently. And also the issue of e-voting that you kind of, rubbed off a little on. We'll come back to it, so please stay with us. We still have Clement Nwankwo, Executive Director of PLAC, with us. There's this issue that has been on the burner for many years, and that's the issue of e-voting. By e-voting, we mean the whole gamut. For this pandemic, however, for this peculiar time, INEC has said it will adopt electronic platforms for the submission of nomination forms by political parties in the governorship elections, as well as in recruiting its ad hoc staff for election duty. Well, how desirable and in alignment with the laws of the land is that?
Well, the laws at this time do not prohibit electronic voting. Indeed, the Electoral Act is quite clear that you could adopt electronic voting. But also the Electoral Act has provisions that mandate manual voting. And indeed, the definition of the process of election in the Electoral Act as it stands clearly has not further expanded on the process and procedure for achieving electronic voting. But I think that countries around the world have different experiences with electronic voting. There are countries where, in fact, electronic voting is specifically prohibited. And this includes countries like the Netherlands, where this was experimented upon, and the experience was resulted in the prohibition of electronic voting. In some countries, it's a mix. In one of the largest, indeed the largest democracy in the world, which is India, electronic voting is actually what takes place. But India's experience is highlighted by the fact that India is one of the most technologically advanced countries in the world. India produces its own electronic voting machines at extremely cheap costs by state-owned companies. So you can't compare that. When we talk about electronic voting in Nigeria, and you can look at even the process of registration of voters that we embarked on, where we had to bring in the direct data capture machines, some of it imported from China, some of it from India. The cost of it was humongous. So countries that have, like India, that have implemented it almost 100%, is because it's exceedingly cheap in India to produce and implement this. And the level of technological savviness in India is incredibly high. The question we must ask ourselves in Nigeria is, do we have the resources to implement a full electronic voting system? And again, what is it that informs shift from one procedure to the other? There must be trust. In this country, the level of trust is exceedingly very low. And so people are going to ask questions. The issue of electronic voting in this country, the controversy around it did not start today. If you remember, if you remember, in the Second Republic between 1979 and 1983, there were conversations to the point that you had professors, and if a lot of us who remember Professor Dele Awujo, you remember the demonstrations he showed that indicated that you could vote for one political party and the machine could manipulate the results to transform into vote for another political party. And this happened even as an example in the U.S. during, if you remember, the controversial votes that were conducted in the U.S., the Florida issue. All of these are challenges that the electronic system faces. In some countries, nobody even talks about electronic voting. In Germany, which is one of the best technological systems in the world as well, they don't even have a conversation about electronic voting. And ballot papers, and this is where I talk about cost of elections. Ballot papers are simply cyclostyled or photocopied papers that people use to vote. In this country, we spend, even with the manual one that we're using right now, this country spends an incredible amount of money taking money out abroad to producers abroad to produce ballot papers of what is sometimes tried to be made to be of currency value.
That's definitely something of concern, Mr. Wankwo. But very, very quickly, there was something you raised the other time. You said we do not have the resources to deploy, to spend or to invest in electronic voting. Just what do you mean by that, really?
Electronic voting is very, very, very expensive. And in this country where procurement issues are always a challenge, we know how much this country spent, how many billions of naira was spent to procure just registration of voter machines, the DDC machines, the direct data capture machines that were used beginning from the 2011 elections. It was a major challenge being able to procure this. And the country had to be running helter-skelter to China, to India, at extremely high cost to produce this. Those machines have a lifespan, and I believe that lifespan perhaps has now come to haunt us, because we have to think what to do about those machines that have lived out their lifespan. So you have the challenge of the cost of it. And in a situation where our GDP is going down, where income is reducing, where revenues are reducing, I do not think that we can begin to talk about the systems, because electronic voting systems are two types. You have the types where you can sit in the comfort of your home and use your iPhone, your iPad, your laptop and vote by internet. And then you have the other system where you have the machines actually installed in the polling units, and people come and press particular buttons and the votes go to where they should go in a normal situation. Now, the question is, are we prepared for the first one, which is the internet-based electronic voting system? Do we have the infrastructure? Do we have internet-based system that can enable people in the remotest parts of this country to vote by their telephone, by their computer or laptop? The answer is no. That would be the cheaper one. Do we have the trust in ourselves, in the system, to enable people to trust that internet-based voting is acceptable? It's a challenge, and we've had recent experiences, and one of the ones that should actually capture our attention is the recent experiences of the Nigerian Bar Association with voting in their election.
Well, Mr. Wankwo, it's interesting, many things that many issues that you're raising now. Question of, is it which one then should we go for? Should we stay with what we have and continue to expend these monies, or do we have a hybrid of the two that you have mentioned, or do we come up with something that is unique to us? There are many questions that we could have loved to engage you on, but we really have to thank you very much for the time and perspectives that you've shared with us this morning. Clement Wankwo is Executive Director of PLAC. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
All right, it's a related development, a related issue coming up right after now. Stay with us.
Well, September the 19th, 2020 will provide us an opportunity to explore that new thinking and to see how well the policy statement that INEC has released regarding conduct of elections, especially in Edo State, which we'll be talking about in a moment, would work. So this morning, let's speak with one of the stakeholders in that election. We're being joined on phone by Mr. Anthony Aziegbemi, who is a state chairman of PDP in Edo. Good morning, and thank you for joining us on the program.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we're seeing the build-up.
Good morning.
Good morning. We're seeing the build-up to the elections. Yes, we've talked about INEC's part, but then let's talk about political parties. I mean, we've heard about the issues in the APC. The PDP also has its own fair share of issues, the ward congresses that were conducted, for example, and the controversy that trailed it. And we're looking forward to the coming election in Edo State. Where does that leave the PDP really in the whole scheme of things?
The PDP, we are very ready for the elections. As you rightly said, there were a few grievances during the congresses held in March. As we speak, most of those grievances and the people aggrieved are being spoken to by multiple sources, trying to get people to understand that there's a bigger picture that wishes to get the party back to Sadebe Avenue. That one might feel like this now, but the person should look at the bigger picture. Look at the larger interest of the party. Look for the greater good for the greater majority of members of the party. So to that extent, we are talking to our great members, and they are listening. They are listening, and we'll go into the primaries coming up between the 23rd and 24th of June with a united front. So we are good. We are good to go.
Right. I know the search for a viable candidate has begun in your party. Yes, you've talked about the primaries, but looking back at what happened, some will say you lost your most viable, in quote, candidate to the APC. And it begs the question, what is the plan here? Some other people are saying you're waiting to, in quote, cash out of the current back and forth in the APC. So what's the plan? What's the strategy for the PDP for the coming elections?
Well, you don't expect me to discuss the strategy of the PDP on a national platform like your respected channels. However, our strength in the PDP lies within us. Our strength doesn't lie in the weakness of our opponent. I don't know what you mean by the most viable candidate in our party. I will say that 3 of our aspirants, as we speak, have bought their forms in the PDP. Any one of these 3 of my aspirants that gets the ticket after 23rd and 24th of June will beat either the incumbent governor or the one you mentioned, the one you said just left our party. Any one of these 3 of my aspirants will beat any one of them. In fact, I even beat both of them joined together. So we know what we need to do. We have our data crunched out. We know what we are dealing with all the issues as it concerns the elections coming up. And don't forget that the APC has not done very well. In fact, has totally failed the state. For instance, it might interest you to know that the APC met a GDP in Edo State of $16 billion in 2008. As we speak, the GDP of Edo State is about a little bit above $10 billion.
Just one moment, Mr. Chairman. Just one moment. There was something that you said earlier that I would like you to take you up on, to follow up on very quickly. You said that, but you remember that your party had already said that your doors are open, that you would welcome anyone who was to come. If the incumbent Governor Obaseki, were to join the PDP today, would you give him the ticket or not?
We maintain the fact that our doors are opened. Governor Obaseki is our governor in the state. If he wants to join the PDP, he is free to do so. Will he get an automatic ticket? The answer is an emphatic no. He will have to go through the processes. Because he's just joining us, he will have to go through the NWC where they might consider giving him a waiver and all that. And then he will still get to the delegates to tell them why he should be given the ticket. So it's a process. And that process is open to every Nigerian. So our doors are not closed at all. We think that Governor Obaseki is being humiliated, is being maltreated by his party. We believe he's being given the wrong side of the stick. Because that is in the DNA of the APC. They only know how to fight. They even fight themselves. So, just one moment, Mr. Chairman. You just said now that the PDP could consider giving a waiver to the incumbent Governor Obaseki if he were to come in. The NWC of the party. You said that that your party could give him a waiver if he decided to join. You could give him a waiver to contest on your platform. Is it the same governor you just said, hasn't done well these past few years? Yes. The answer to that, what you heard stemmed from the question you asked earlier. We will give him an automatic ticket And I said, no. Can he join the party? Yes. Can he be given a waiver? Yes. Can he contest in the primaries? Yes, of course. That's what I'm saying.
But you
that
just
doesn't mean
said...
that he did well or he didn't do well. That's not the issue here.
Okay. Okay, let's move to another one of concern, which is the INEC guidelines. One of the things that's still relatively blurry is that of campaigns. How do you intend to handle political campaigns in the light of this COVID-19?
Well, clearly, COVID-19 does put some added strains on campaigns as we used to know them. But that's why we are human beings. Our brains are structured to think of new ways of doing things. Challenges are not new. The human race has been known to some much challenges, and this is just one of them. I'm sure that with the INEC guidelines on COVID-19 and with the state guidelines on COVID-19, we are law-abiding. We are a law-abiding party. We will do what is within the guidelines to get our votes, to get our message to the voters. So as far as that is concerned, we are very much ready. We are ready. We have a message to take to our people. I mean, the rate of insecurity in the country, in the state, in the country is unbearable. The hunger is unbearable. So there are a lot of things we can tell our people, and we will think of ingenious ways of getting around the pandemic.
Okay.
And thankfully, the pandemic we expect to get to the peak in Edo State sometimes at the middle of the month or thereabout.
Okay, you know what? All right, would like you to hold your thoughts for a moment, for a few minutes. We'll need to go to break right now, but when we come back, we'll need to explore some further issues with you. So please join us again. Well, it's our concluded moments now. We still have with us Mr. Anthony Azegbami, who is chairman of the People's Democratic Party in Edo State. Well, earlier on, you said that you believe that the governor has been treated unfairly by his party. And it begs the question, have you been in talks with him in recent times? Has there been some form of, meeting, as it were, with the governor in recent times?
No, there has not been a meeting with him.
So when reports came out that, he had probably showed interest and then you debunked it, was there any form of follow-up?
No.
Right. So now, talking about the plan of your party in light of COVID-19 and what you hope to do, in terms of the party primaries, in terms of the electioneering, the whole campaigning process, are you worried that this might dampen the chances of your party? Because from what we've seen from campaigns and what have you, the strength of the people usually shows the strength of the party. So are you concerned that maybe this might just dampen the party's chances?
I don't think so. I think conversely, I think we would do better because we are in the same boat with the other party, and we have so many things to say that we believe will the people will appreciate. The citizens of Edo State will appreciate. And our task basically is to fashion out those ways and means, meanwhile adhering to the protocols of COVID-19, both the state government and the federal government, get the message to our people and get the votes out. You'll be surprised that the people are so dissatisfied with this APC-led administration in the state. A party that won 24 over 24 in the House of Assembly, they cannot properly get themselves inaugurated. They throw bombs into each other's houses. The level of insecurity, our women, our children cannot go to the farms anymore. The schools are in bad shape. It's just unbelievable. So we as I said earlier, they've depleted our GDP from 16 billion to 10 billion. If we give them another 4 years, They will bring it down to 5 billion. I'm sure everybody will die of hunger in Edo State.
You know, you raised a lot of issues, Mr. Tony Azegbemi, really. You talked about the State Assembly, and a lot of people are wondering what happens, especially when there's a majority of APC in the party. What are the plans of the PDP to come in? But you know what, we'd like to thank you so much for your time. This is definitely an ongoing conversation. We've been speaking with Mr. Tony Azegbemi, who is the chairman of the PDP in Edo State. Thank you so much, and we wish you the very best.
Thank you.
Well, and I guess that's a fine place to leave it, as we usually say. Thank you so much for your time. If you'd like to see some of the feedback that have come on, please go to our Twitter handle to see so many of them that have already come in. And of course, you can drop yours as well. If you wish to see a replay of this, of course, it will be on YouTube as well. That's too much we can take today. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Ayo Makinde.
I'm Kayode Kikiolu.
And I'm Malfa Ogun Yusuf. Thank you.